So today I'm wearing my city hat, following on from Ashley's vibe of this morning on flexible adaptation pathways. And I want to talk about the role of cities as first responders to climate change. So for those of us, there's some colleagues here who have been doing climate change impacts for quite a while. It's actually quite striking when you think about it that cities were so long overlooked. Like that ag work started long ago, and ecosystem work. These were the main topics in the beginning. And cities just really weren't on anybody's radar screen in terms of climate change work and research and global change research even. And this is despite uniquely relevant factors that we all know. That cities now hold a majority of the global population. They are the hubs of the global economic activity, both local, national, and globally. Many of them have great exposure on the coasts and on rivers. They also, linked to the hubs of the economic activity and the population, they are responsible for a high percentage of greenhouse gas emissions. And they are home, as we all know, to highly vulnerable groups. So I want you to imagine this picture, and all the climate scientists in the room have seen these kinds of maps many, many times, right? These are the projected temperature change in the 2050s, mean of 35 CMIP 5 global climate models, RCP 4.5, the 2050s minus the 71 to 2000 average. And we've seen this map globally with either no governmental boundaries on it at all, or if they were boundaries, they were national. But what we did in this map was we just overlaid all the cities that we're working on in the Urban Climate Change Research Network. And this is to begin to think about, well, what will be happening in the cities? You can see that all of the cities are projected to be in zones with higher temperatures too, right? So certainly on the impact side of the climate change challenges, they are very much on the front lines. But what they have been doing lately, which is very interesting to me, is that they are emerging as the first responders to climate change. Both to climate extremes and to change across the globe. So how are they doing this, and what's the proof that they're actually doing this? So the first proof I offer is the Paris Agreement. And you can see this is the actual language where cities are explicitly recognized as playing an important role in responses to climate change. By the way, getting this word, cities, into the Paris Agreement was the work of almost 15 years' work, at least 10, of the major city groups around the world who would come and lobby the nation states in all of the negotiation sections to recognize the role of cities as partners in responses. Very often when I would show this slide previously, before the Paris Agreement, I would say, cities act while nations talk. It took the nations 20 years to come up with the Paris Agreement. The cities themselves have been forming networks in which they agree to mutually reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, basically for the past, again, 5 to 10 years. Now, I've just highlighted the most recent action of the cities on the mitigation side, on reducing greenhouse gas side. This is the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy that was just promulgated in just January of 2017. What this did was it brought two major groups together, the European Covenant of Mayors and the Compact of Mayors, which was another group of cities making alliances to reduce greenhouse gases. So right now, the total numbers of cities committed to reducing greenhouse gases is over 7,000. The total number of countries represented as 120, 120. And it represents, of course, not the whole population by any means, but it's beginning to be a significant factor in terms of the commitment to reducing greenhouse gases. Now, I'm going to talk about three main things for the rest of the time, and I really want to talk fast. I'm from New York, so I know how to talk fast, because I want to get to be sure we have discussion, because I'm raising some challenging questions that I really want to hear your input on. So first of all, I'm very interested in why is it that cities emerged as leaders? So I think it's clear that they are and are leading. But why is it that they are? What is it about cities that make them the right level of governance to respond? The second one is I'm going to talk a little bit about New York and lessons from Hurricane Sandy, our mega climate extreme event that we had, and what were some of the things we learned about climate change and the relationship of climate extremes in the now and the development of resilience and adaptation in the future. I call that science in time and place. And then I want to end with talking about knowledge partnerships, in particular from the assessment report on climate change in cities. This is the first version of it. The second one is in press at Cambridge University Press. And I'm going to share with you some of the major findings of that report. So this is what we all know. The headline here is what we all know. Cities face multiple stresses. Both infrastructure and inhabitants are highly vulnerable to climate extremes. So on the left you see here are the stresses, probably most well known and most serious stresses in most cities. The urban heat island, exacerbated runoff due to impervious surfaces, poor air quality, and then for cities on the coast, coastal flooding. The point I want to emphasize here is that it's not just that they suffer from these stresses, it's that the cities for years, in fact decades or maybe even centuries, have come together to have goals about doing something about these stresses, and they have done active interventions to ameliorate them. So I'm going to do a very quick flying tour of these major stresses. Though the first one we all know is the urban heat island, in which surface and air temperatures in urban centers are often warmer than surrounding areas. And we have great NASA imagery that shows this in cities all around the world. On the right of each one of this set of slides is the interventions that cities are actively doing to reduce and deal with the particular environmental stress. So in this case, these are white and green roofs in New York City that, with the help of subsidies from the city and programs, cool roofs programs, getting young people to come out and paint all those white roofs, they work on combating the urban heat island, in the case of the white roofs, increasing the albedo, and green roofs by increasing evapotranspiration. The next stress is exacerbated runoff. Extreme rainfall events over short time periods combined with those impervious surfaces cause urban flooding. On the left you see this is the NASA iMerge product, which brings together all the global precipitation imagery data that measuring in near real time. And this is showing the heavy rainfall, for example, over, in this case, the Dominican Republic, over the populated areas there and the cities there. And then on the right, one of the resilient cities that we were talking about this morning in the Viva, Copenhagen, is very much a leader in developing, really moving beyond just sort of minor implementation of amelioration of stresses. They are redesigning their city with water plazas, retention basements, porous pavement all over the place throughout the whole city to reduce the runoff volume and the peak flow of water, and also the pollutant transport during heavy rainfall events. Then, of course, here's the one we all know about, poor air quality. And everyone also knows the example here is Beijing, which is one of the places. There are other places as well. And in fact, I could instead show Salt Lake City in the United States. It is located in a basin. It has terrible problems with inversions. And Salt Lake City in Utah is working and doing very similar things as Beijing, for example, is doing to try to ameliorate this quality. So there you can see the imagery showing the poor air quality. And then, for example, one of the things that can be done, and this is one of the things that Beijing is doing, is the odd-even license plate restrictions, for example. Finally, on the coastal flooding, and we have Robert Nichols here. It's so great that he could be here. Many urban areas located near and along the coast are placing their city residents at risk from coastal flooding. Of course, this is the really important example, of course, from New York, Hurricane Katrina in 2005. And then on the right, the intervention to tidal barriers, dikes, wetland restoration, providing solutions to coastal flooding, storm surge, and erosion. Okay, so this is what cities have been doing. That's their bread and butter, their nuts and bolts that they do. Now let's go to the IPCC urban chapter and how climate change will be affecting these stresses. And I just want to point out that there wasn't a really viable urban chapter in the IPCC until the last assessment report, until AR5. And it's a very good chapter, and one of the things it does is it gives the projections of those changes in those environmental stresses. So, first of all, increased frequency of hot days and possibly increased air pollution. It will modify the urban heat island in cities. In this case, some of the modeling shows that it will reduce in many areas. Some show increases in the urban heat island. I think this has to do with that when everything is getting warmer, the actual surrounding areas are, the differential between the urban and the rural is actually lessening. Flooding due to increased heavy rainfall will lead to destruction of property and infrastructure. And of course, rising sea levels and flooding in conjunction with storm surge. So what we see is that cities have decades of experience dealing with environmental stresses. So then when climate change comes along, they don't view this as something new that they have to deal with that they never thought about before. They've been dealing with these kinds of problems, and now they see that these risks are increasing, but they're really much more ready to take them on board. So it also seems, and this is thanks very much to social science colleagues from ARC3, is that cities are also the right level for climate action in terms of some of their relationships to their citizens. So city leaders have direct contact with their inhabitants, like they're, taking the tube to work alongside their citizens. I sometimes say, for when those coastal storms happen, how does the national government, this is perhaps more in a bigger country than England, but in our country, in the US, how does the president, what happens when there's a big coastal storm event? How does the president interact, and how does the mayor? So the president basically helicopters in and helicopters out. The mayors are there dealing with the extreme events day in and day out to actually work. The city governments are involved in day-to-day management of environmental stresses. They're more practical. And what we've also seen, very importantly, that they're more nimble, that they've been able to form coordination networks with other cities. So for those of you who work in the urban and climate change field, there's C40, Cities Climate Group, there's ICLE, there's UCLG, there's many, many city groups that have formed, and basically those groups are then the groups that have led that global compact of mayors, which I showed, and the global covenant that I showed earlier. However, not to paint a completely rosy picture about all of this, there is real challenges as well. So the first challenge is multiple jurisdiction. There's not a city in the world that's not embedded, maybe Singapore, because Singapore is a city and a country at the same time. But most cities are embedded in a province or a state and a country, and now we have, such as the Paris Agreement, we have international agreements as well. So managing these kinds of responses across the multiple jurisdiction is a challenge. Of course, the next one is in terms of, let's say, financing resilience or financing adaptation measures. It would be pretty hard for most cities to take on the financing of some of the larger projects, for example, the barriers that we were seeing in New Orleans. So financing is a very big challenge for many cities. And then the uptake of the climate challenges both within and across cities is very uneven. So we have early adopters in some agencies. We have one right here with Tim Reeder, but there's also then agencies. It took our MTA just years later to finally get on the climate change bandwagon. So this uptake is uneven. The one I also want to emphasize here at the university and for us as researchers is that there is a need for strong knowledge foundation in place so science-based decisions can be made in time. And another challenge is, so I think together this is what we really are thinking about. How do we create that knowledge base so that all cities, not just the large cities, the mega cities, kind of the hotshot cities who have taken this on. How about all the small and the medium-sized cities as well that are critical? So let's turn to New York and what we learned in Hurricane Sandy. Science in time and science in place. So in New York City, we have the New York City Panel on Climate Change, which was originally convened by Mayor Bloomberg, and that was in 2008. That was the first round. Then we finished the report. You can see it's one of the ones in the back of this set. And then there was a quiet period, and the city would say to us, "Oh yes, let's get going again. We need to get this going again." But it hadn't really happened. Then in really basically right after Hurricane Sandy, which was in October of 2012, the city called us right away, and they said, "We need you to reconvene." And they reconvened the panel right after Hurricane Sandy. And we're now in the third iteration of the New York City panel, which was started in 2015. So what we did was earlier, the panel had produced the first set of climate projections specific to the New York City region, which were then updated in 2013 and 2015. Another aspect of this is that New York, the City Council of New York passed Local Law 42, which requires regular climate science updates each administration. So it's not, the whole thing doesn't have to be kind of spun up again from scratch. It's ongoing. And I think that that's also a very important, that's what I mean by science in time and science in place. If the panel had not already done work creating the projections beforehand, the first set, we would never have been able to oh my gosh, what are we doing? How do we do this? How do we do the downscaling? What do we do? Right, how do we do quantitative projections? How do we do qualitative? All of this. All these real questions for making tailored climate risk information we had done before. So that then, after Hurricane Sandy, when the city really needed a new set of projections for the rebuilding, to use in the rebuilding, taking increasing climate risk due to climate change into account, then we were ready to go. So these projections that were then made after Hurricane Sandy were used in the guidelines for rebuilding after Hurricane Sandy. This was not done after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. It's only in New York where Mayor Bloomberg and Governor Cuomo and President Obama, remember those 3 levels of governance, they all said together, we must take climate change into account in the rebuilding. Okay, how do we actually do it in New York? And I'm thinking, I know a little bit about how London does it, so one of the questions I'm very interested in is, how does this compare? So one of the top is leadership. It's crucially important to have good leadership to actually say this is important, we need to take this into account. The next part is coordination. Climate change affects everything and everybody. It's like really complicated all over the place. You need a body that's actually thinking about really bringing it together and coordinating. And we have a citywide sustainability office, and it's actually, the name changes in different administrations. On the implementation side in New York, we have the Stakeholder Task Force. It's called the Climate Change Adaptation Task Force. These are the specific people with responsibility for the energy, transportation, water and waste, and communication systems of the city. And then on the right, we have the knowledge providers, which is the NPCC. It's made up of both university scholars and private sector experts. We were talking about insurance experts and interacting with insurance companies at lunch. Social, biological, physical scientists. We have legal and insurance experts, risk management professionals. So this is the structure that has pretty much held through the 3 convenings of the NPCC. So I'm so glad that Tim is here because this is what New York stole from London, in particular, Tim. So when was it? It must have been pretty much 2009. Yeah, it was probably 2009. I was in London and I came and met Tim, and we had the flexible adaptation pathway discussion, and so I brought it back to New York. And this is the New York version of the narrative around. It's not the specific ones that you all have done a lot of work on, and that's what Ashley presented. But this is the actual, the conceptual model of the flexible adaptation pathway. So just very briefly, because just a couple of things I think are important about it is the blue squiggly line in the back is the level of acceptable risk. So in the beginning we had a straight line that a city would have the people who live there would have an acceptable level of risk, and then that's what all of the adaptation pathway would have to be dealing with that. But clearly that acceptable level of risk changes. For example, after Hurricane Sandy, people wanted a lot more protection than they did before, for example, in New York. So that's the acceptable level of risk. Status quo with climate change, we're going to exceed that level of risk. Even if we only do mitigation in a city, which was just a contribution, of course, really what we have to be doing is the yellow, and the final one, the yellow line is the adaptation without mitigation, but really for a city to actually be and fulfill their leadership role as first responders to climate change, to stay beneath that acceptable level of risk, the city has to take on flexible adaptation pathways with mitigation. And here's we call it monitoring. You call it monitoring and evaluation, M&E. We call it indicators and monitoring. But this is the monitoring and reassess. So that's the New York version of it. Okay, I'm going to quickly run through the climate change projections because I know the climate is part of the Institute. The way we do it is we take projections, they're probabilistic. We take, in this last round, downscaled 35 GCMs, 2 RCPs, and then we utilize those and we show them in this kind of, according to these percentiles. And those percentiles were were requested by the stakeholders. We showed them various iterations of the top right, and they said, okay, what we really want is the 10th percentile and the 90th percentile and the middle range. And so that's what we actually then co-produced with them, really, in terms of the risk information that we were providing. We also do qualitative projections. When we feel the models are not robust, we're very clear. The models are good for some things. They are not yet good for everything yet, and we hope that they will be. But we're very clear about qualitative projections when we provide them. I didn't put in the whole sea level rise 6-component approach, but we have a great group of sea level rise scientists who did really state-of-the-science projections for the sea level rise. And these are all peer-reviewed, latest scientific literature, observed climate data, and with explicit caveats about uncertainties. And on the bottom are the sea level rise changes in the coastal. These are changes in the coastal flooding. This is the 500-year flood zones with the high estimate 90th percentile and the colors are the time with the red up to from the 2020s to the 2100. I'm not going to read you all the different numbers, but you can always see it's always a range. And we work with infographics. We work with the team of the city graphics folks to make infographics so that they can be understood. This is you all have this from UK SIP, so in some ways you all have it much easier. We don't have that. We finally now in the United States, well, we're not sure what will be happening now, but up until just very recently, finally, the National Climate Assessment was getting its act together to give us scenarios so that in some of this, you still have to work with your stakeholders to provide them and tailor them and make sure that they understand them. But it won't be quite as onerous. I just show this to show that when there are stakeholder questions that we're not able to answer with the models. So, for example, and also we're not at the scale of a city. You can't really say too much about the total number of tropical cyclones that will strike New York City. You just absolutely can't. So we try to be very careful about the scale of projection, the direction of change, the likelihood. We use IPCC likelihood metrics, and of course the sources. So, were these projections used? Is it being used? So this slide is to prove it. So after Hurricane Sandy in June of 2013, NPCC released its projections, and the city released its report on its plan for recovery and rebuilding a stronger, more resilient New York. And that plan included recommendations to utilize and guidelines for using the projections. There was updated regulations to increase the resiliency of buildings. For example, the hospitals, because we had evacuations of hospitals in New York City. We're working with the Federal Emergency Management Agency on the flood insurance rate maps. There's a big project, over $300 million for protecting. It's called the Big U, and that's with Dutch. That's helped and designed by Dutch colleagues. Comprehensive flood prevention system for Lower Manhattan, and of course vegetated green streets. And all together, the Resiliency Plan is $20 billion of programs to increase the resilience. I just want to point out the middle part, which comes from it's called the SIRR report, which says resilient, and it says able to bounce back after change or adversity, capable of preparing for, responding to, and recovering from difficult conditions. Synonym tough. See also New York City. So this whole kind of cultural gestalt is also very important. Okay. And then finally, this is also a big topic in Ashley's work, urban indicators and monitoring. In the New York system, they are divided into climate hazards, all the impacts part, and the adaptation measures. And they just are absolutely critical for moving forward to actually work, for flexible adaptation pathways to work. You absolutely have to have the measurements so you know when you're reaching near that acceptable level of risk so actions can be taken and then re-evaluated. And in this regard, this is wearing my NASA hat, we're doing a very interesting project in developing with Microsoft a tool for a decision support tool utilizing NASA remote sensing, and we're starting out with predictive information about extreme heat events. So I have to say, it's very fun being in those meetings with the Microsoft software developers to see how they really do it. It's quite interesting. Okay, let's turn to knowledge partnerships. So my point here is that urban adaptation is expensive. The estimates of the annual cost range between 80 to 100 billion, of which 80% will be borne in urbanized areas. And we now are having funds getting going with the Adaptation Fund, Green Climate Fund, GEF, Urban Program, right, for mechanisms for disbursement. Now, I ask you, how can this level of funding actually happen unless we, the university community, provide the knowledge foundation so that that water will not be poured on sand? That is really, I believe, our challenge. So how do we do that? So this is the reason why the Urban Climate Change Research Network was formed, and I invite all of you to join. The mission is to provide knowledge that enables cities to fulfill their climate change leadership potential in both mitigation and adaptation, with a focus on developing resiliency and transformation. Over 750 scientists and experts, 100 cities. It was formed in 2007, so it's 10 years old at the time of the C40. And we held one of our meetings, so I put in at the Crystal. Siemens hosted us there. So one of the main things that the network does is it creates assessment reports on climate change in cities. And this is it's comparable in some ways, it's analogous, I would say, to an IPCC for cities. So the first one, this is the first one, it was published in 2011. The second one is in press at Cambridge University Press right now. It was launched at Habitat 3 in Quito, Ecuador. And the summary for city leaders, which is, it looks like that, was launched at COP21, the Climate Summit for Local Leaders that was hosted by Mayor Anne Hidalgo of Paris and Mayor Bloomberg. This is the framework. We've talked about summary for city leaders. This is the set of chapters, and this is why one of the things I say is IPCC is great and wonderful, and the link to the national governments, it's very important. But the IPCC has one chapter on cities. The ARC3, the second volume of this, has 16 chapters to cover all of the different topics: climate science for urban areas, disasters and risk, mitigation and adaptation, planning and design, equity and environmental justice, economics, finance, private sector, ecosystems, biodiversity, coastal zones. And by the way, in the ecosystems and biodiversity, that's where we have the food. I'm looking at John. The food part is there. Coastal zones, health, housing, energy, transportation, water systems, solid waste, and governance. So it's a lot of things. So one of the things that and actually many of you maybe know Rich Endiconnell, one of the, I think, certainly early practitioners at UKCIP. When I met with her, she's on the advisory board of ARC3. She said, you have to do case studies because city leaders want to talk to each other. They don't really, I mean, they like to talk with us, but they really like to talk to each other. So we do case studies, which is really cities to cities saying, this is what we're doing in our city, this is what we're doing in our city. So we now have 100+ case studies, that's the little map on the right, with, and it's a searchable database with population, GDP, climate zone, et cetera. And then the other part that we have is regional hubs to do the disseminating. I think this is also something with IPCC. IPCC, they do the volumes, they kind of, you know, people kind of talk about them and they get on people's shelves, but there isn't this active, real dissemination. So we're working very much with our hubs on that. Okay, so here's perhaps the controversial part, because this is, I'm now going to tell you the main findings, and this is the last thing I'm going to talk about, is the main findings of the 16 chapters. So it hasn't been published yet. So even when it comes out, you still have to get it, okay? But this is what really, from poring over all the chapters with all the authors, what really we came to is that to actually fulfill or even excel in their role, perhaps it's a better word, excel, in their role as climate change leaders, which is they're trying to be, they're emerging as that to really make this happen, profound changes, otherwise perhaps known as the T word, transformation, will be required in all the urban systems and in consumption and lifestyles. So let's not kid it's basically, this is about, are we kidding ourselves to think that we can do flexible adaptations all the way without this? So that's what I want to get to, so we can be sure to have discussion. Okay, I'm going to quickly go through the FiveFold, we call it the FiveFold Path, these are like what cities really need to actually do to make this happen. So the first one is, actions that reduce greenhouse gas emissions while increasing resilience are a win-win. So here's the thing. We still have just tremendous bifurcation. Adaptation is on one side, mitigation is on the other. In cities, really and truly, they have to be, not in every case, but so much more, they have to be thought of together. And that's what this is, the figure is from the Urban Planning and Design chapter. They are all over this. And there may be some urban planners and designers here. They are all over the combination of designing cities that will be low carbon emissions and adaptable to the climate extremes and stresses. So that's the first one. The second one is, it brings two things together: the disaster risk reduction and the climate change adaptation. So as we know, this is two major and different communities. But little by little, they have started coming together. But clearly, for cities to actually fulfill their potential, they really have to work on the disaster risk reduction side, which is the current major extreme events. At the same time, they have to make sure that they are thinking about climate adaptation on the longer term planning. So bringing together these short-term and longer-term scales, I think, is a major, major challenge. But that's pathway 2. Pathway 3 is how to go about it also. Risk assessments and climate change action, climate action plans really must be co-generated with the full range of stakeholders and scientists to be the most effective. So this is to really talk about how it can't just be a small group, and it can't just be the city governments, even though a lot of times they say, okay, fine, thank you, scientists, check, we've got it, we'll take it from here. I'm sure those of you who've worked with stakeholders, there's part of the dynamic. But really, it's because of the complexity of the urban system and systems, we really need to have the process of co-generation with stakeholders and scientists, which I think very much is happening here in the UK, but it's definitely not happening everywhere. The fourth one is also crucially important. And this came not just from the environmental justice and equity chapter, but throughout all the chapters. The housing chapter, for example. The needs of the most disadvantaged and vulnerable citizens should be addressed in climate change planning and action. If we're not thinking about the poor neighborhoods, if we're not thinking about those vulnerable people, a city will not be prepared. And finally, this is the nuts and bolts one. This is, cities have to advance their city creditworthiness. So, for example, the World Bank is having training courses for city finance managers to teach them how to apply for credit. And also training, for example, to apply all those three, GEF and Green Climate Fund and everything. Making those applications are incredibly hard for cities to do. So this advancing the city creditworthiness, really learning how to do these things, absolutely essential. Developing robust city institutions. This is absolutely clear. This comes from the governance chapter. And some cities have robust institutions. Many do not. So the political and the governance side very much has to be strengthened in the cities across the world. And finally, participating in city networks. So this is the third part. And the cities, that's what they're doing. It's great because they form working groups about rapid transit, and they form working groups about supply chains and how to buy things with lower carbon footprint. All these things are this learning, and also not a city just pulling in and being unto itself, but really having those connections because cities are connected with financial flows, with migration flows, with commodities flows. All those flows are part of this, and this participation in the learning networks is also critically important. So those are the FiveFold pathways for cities to actually really fulfill their leadership potential. This is the last slide. So, if the cities do all those things that we just were looking at, that we're just thinking about, I submit that the cities will then be going a long way to fulfilling the Sustainable Development Goal number 11, which is, for the first time, the SDGs has an urban SDG. I was part of the campaign, the global campaign, to get this in. At the reception, I'll tell you some of the stories about what it was like to try to get an SDG in to the 17. The goal as written is make cities and human settlements inclusive. We talked about that in the 5 pathways. Safe, of course, there's human aspects to safety, but there's also environmental aspects to safety. Resilient, we talked a lot about resilience. And sustainable in terms of mitigation, but also putting this whole package together then will really be going a long way. Climate change and responding to climate change will be really getting the cities not just on the road to fulfilling their leadership potentials on climate change, but to sustainability as well. Thank you. With all the websites.